Did you know that geneticists estimate that nearly 1 in every 200 men alive today could be a direct descendant of Genghis Khan? That's around 16 million men sharing the same bloodline. Because what Genghis Khan did to the women he captured wasn't just brutal. It was calculated, cruel, and chilling. Genghis Khan harem was not a place of privilege, but a prison. His harem was vast, a shadowy realm filled with hundreds, possibly thousands, of women captured from every corner of the world he conquered. The women who survived the bloodshed, who weren't killed outright, were brought to the Khan's camp. Some from the walls of China, others from the heart of Persia, even from the far reaches of Russia. To him, they were not individuals, but commodities, tools to expand his empire and solidify his bloodline. Once in his grasp, these women were stripped of their past. No longer did they have names, no longer did they have families. They became known only by their position in the harem, where they were assigned a number, a ranking, depending on their beauty, age, and status. The most beautiful would be brought to the Khan's side. Others, those less fortunate or older, might be sent to the warriors under his command. But it was not just beauty that Genghis valued. It was power. These women were brought to ensure that his lineage would continue, to build his empire through the blood of countless generations. His desire to breed an unbroken line of descendants was so strong that he kept his women under constant surveillance. They were imprisoned within the walls of the harem, isolated from the world, living in fear of their Khan. Their only role was to bear his children, and to bear them quickly. If a woman caught the eye of the Khan, she was pulled into his service. If she displeased him, she was discarded, or worse. But these women weren't the only victims. The women sent to his generals or other powerful Mongol leaders weren't treated much better. They were used to cement political ties, traded like cattle in a game of power. The men who received them had their pick of the lot, sometimes keeping them as personal slaves, sometimes giving them away to other soldiers as rewards. The women who bore the Khan's children were also given no rights, no power, nothing beyond their service. The women's fates were decided based solely on Genghis Khan's whims. One might rise in favor, only to fall the next day, discarded like an object no longer needed. For many of them, the harem was a life sentence, where the only escape was death. What we often forget about history is how the stories of these women were buried. Their suffering erased from the grand narrative. But the truth is, these women were among the most oppressed, living a life of uncertainty, violence, and fear. For Genghis Khan, the women in his harem were not just symbols of conquest or pleasure. They were vessels, tools for creating an empire that would stretch across continents. The most horrifying aspect of this system was not the sheer number of women he captured, but what he did with them once they were in his grasp. The women were forced into motherhood not out of choice, but out of necessity for Genghis Khan's bloodline. He needed heirs. His empire demanded it, and the women, like the men who fought for him, were expendable in the service of his vision. To him, each child born carried the potential to strengthen the Mongol Empire, to further his legacy. Each child, whether a son or a daughter, was another link in the chain that would eventually spread his bloodline far and wide. Genghis Khan's obsession with lineage went beyond traditional notions of succession. It was about power, about ensuring that the empire he built could not only endure, but expand exponentially. And the women he kept in his harem were central to that plan. Some women bore children out of fear. Others were simply worn down by years of forced pregnancies. They didn't have the luxury of deciding whether or not they wanted to have children. Their bodies became vessels for the future Mongol rulers. It didn't matter if the women were willing or not. Genghis Khan had a singular focus: to create as many descendants as possible. And he succeeded. The numbers are staggering. In fact, geneticists estimate that nearly 1 in every 200 men today could be a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. Studies suggest that his bloodline has spread so widely that it's possible for up to 16 million men alive today to share his DNA. This staggering genetic footprint, it turns out, is the result of Genghis Khan's meticulous and brutal breeding system. But it wasn't just about having children. It was about control. The women in the harem were often watched closely during their pregnancies. Those who couldn't bear children or failed to meet the Khan's expectations were discarded, sometimes executed, and replaced with younger women. They were viewed as little more than breeding machines. For the women who gave birth to sons, the situation wasn't much better. The children born to Genghis Khan's concubines often found themselves in a brutal race for power, as Genghis' sons and grandsons fought viciously to claim their inheritance. These women were trapped in a cycle where their children's futures were decided by force, political alliances, and deadly rivalry. Even after they bore the Khan's children, many women were not treated as mothers. Their primary role was to serve Genghis Khan's ambitions, to ensure that his empire and his bloodline continued to flourish. For these women, motherhood became an unending nightmare. Their bodies, once free, were now merely part of a system designed to serve the whims of one man. Their children were pawns in a game they couldn't escape, and their existence was entirely at the mercy of a conqueror who saw them as little more than tools for his vision of domination. Genghis Khan didn't just conquer lands, he dismantled entire civilizations, leaving nothing but destruction in his wake. But there was something that set him apart from other conquerors: the way he treated the people he captured, especially women. When Genghis Khan's forces stormed a city, the aftermath was like nothing the world had ever seen. Villages were burned, men slaughtered, and women were taken. But this wasn't just about survival. For Genghis, women were spoils of war, tools to be controlled, used, and traded like currency. After a battle, the surviving women, whether they were noble women or simple peasants, were rounded up, separated from their families, and ranked. They weren't asked. They weren't spared. They were simply categorized. The most beautiful women were given as rewards to his warriors, his loyal soldiers. But those who were deemed more useful weren't left behind. Genghis Khan would keep them for himself. The Mongol Empire grew on the backs of these women. With every city sacked, more were added to his ever-growing harem. They were stripped of their names, their homes, and their identities. They became nothing moth and tools to create more power for Genghis Khan. It wasn't just the women who were given away. His soldiers and his generals were also rewarded with women as if they were gifts. If a general proved himself loyal, he might receive 20, 30, or even more women to add to his own collection. The women, once captured, had little choice. They could submit to this new life, or they could face the horrors of rejection, cruelty, and execution. It was an empire built on fear, and women were the currency used to solidify his rule. And as his empire spread, so did the power he held over countless lives. They were nothing but trophies in the hands of the conqueror. This was the world Genghis Khan created, a world where women weren't just captured. They were enslaved, reduced to objects of conquest in a game of power and domination. Genghis Khan ruled with an iron will, and anyone, man or woman, who defied him faced consequences that were swift, severe, and unforgiving. For the women who lived in his harem, obedience was not a choice, it was a necessity for survival. If a woman resisted the Khan, if she defied him in any way, there was no mercy. History tells of instances where women who disobeyed were punished in unimaginable ways. But what's even more chilling is how this punishment was often public, meant to send a message to others who might think to challenge the Khan's authority. One of the most infamous stories comes from a woman who dared to insult Genghis Khan. She had once been part of his harem, but later found herself disgraced and angry at the power he held over her. In an act of defiance, she openly mocked him, perhaps underestimating just how far he would go to maintain his control. The punishment was brutal. Her entire family was executed, and she herself was killed. This is the reality of Genghis Khan's empire. It wasn't just about controlling his subjects. It was about ensuring fear, ensuring obedience. Women were punished for the smallest perceived slight, and if a woman did anything to dishonor the Khan, her life was often forfeit. This brutality wasn't limited to just those within the harem. Even women of noble birth, once considered untouchable, were not spared from his wrath. Many of these women didn't have the luxury of challenging the Khan. Defying him wasn't just dangerous, it was fatal. Resistance, whether through subtle acts of rebellion or outright defiance, was met with swift, violent retribution. And the legacy of this terror is something that ripples through history, leaving the stories of these women buried, their resistance silenced. Today, we hear the name Genghis Khan, and we often think of the warrior, the empire builder, the military genius. His conquests are the stuff of legend. But buried deep within the history of his empire lies the forgotten legacy of those who were left behind, those who were silenced in his rise to power. The stories of the women who suffered under his rule are rarely told. History, much like the Khan's empire, has a tendency to overlook the powerless. The women who were captured, enslaved, and forced into lives of submission and fear were stripped of their identity, their dignity, and their voice. We know their pain only through fragmented records, through hints and whispers that have survived the centuries. What's most tragic is how easily these women were erased from history. Their lives, their suffering, their courage, all lost in the shadows of Genghis Khan's glory. And in a sense, they were just as much victims of history as they were victims of Genghis Khan. We may never know their names, their full stories, or the extent of their suffering, but their legacy is one of resilience even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. This dark chapter in history raises a question we must all grapple with. Do we glorify power without considering the cost? Genghis Khan's empire is remembered as one of the greatest in history, but it was built on the backs of women who had no choice, no voice, and no escape. The truth behind Genghis Khan's empire is a story of power, fear, and the forgotten lives that were lost in his pursuit of domination. But the voices of these women, their suffering, their resilience, should never be forgotten. It's time we remember them, not just as casualties of war, but as victims of a brutal system that treated them as nothing more than commodities. If this story shocked you, made you question the history we've been taught, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Let's keep these untold stories alive. And if you're ready to dive deeper into the darkest corners of history, make sure to subscribe, because the untold stories are waiting to be uncovered.